A billionaire found two homeless twin sisters in the winter, crying and pointing toward an abandoned plane. A few minutes later, he entered the plane and broke down in tears at what he saw inside. The howl of the wind cut through the night like a desperate scream. Thomas Bennett gripped the steering wheel of his BMW X7, his knuckles white in contrast with the black leather. The snowstorm outside seemed intent on devouring everything in its path, turning the urban landscape into a white, indistinct blur. Thomas muttered a curse under his breath forming small clouds in the car's frigid air. What was he doing out here, driving in this infernal storm, when he could have been in his heated penthouse, savoring a 25-year Macallan? The meeting with the investors had run longer than expected, and now he was paying the price for his stubbornness in insisting on driving home that night. A sudden movement in the corner of his eye made Thomas slam on the brakes. The luxury car skidded on the snow for several yards, Thomas's heart pounding against his chest as he fought to keep control. When he finally stopped, he took a deep breath, trying to calm his frayed nerves. That was when he saw them. Two small figures on the sidewalk, almost invisible in the storm. Thomas blinked several times, certain his exhausted mind was playing tricks on him. But the figures remained there, as still as ice statues in the midst of the white chaos. Against all common sense, Thomas opened the car door. The icy wind hit him like a punch, making him stagger for a moment. Shielding his eyes with a gloved hand, he cautiously approached the figures. They were two little girls, identical twins, no older than 5. They stood hand in hand, their small bodies trembling violently in the cold. Their thin, worn dresses offered laughable protection against winter's fury. "My God, what are you doing out here?" Thomas shouted to be heard over the howling wind. The girls didn't answer. Instead, they raised their arms in unison, pointing to something beyond the street. Thomas followed the direction indicated and felt his stomach drop. There, almost invisible through the curtain of snow, was the surreal silhouette of an airplane. Not a toy plane or a replica, but a real airplane, abandoned in a vacant lot, as if it had fallen from the sky and been forgotten by time. Thomas looked back at the girls, confusion stamped on his face. You want to go over there?" The twins nodded silently, their large, pleading eyes fixed on him. There was something in that look, a silent urgency that pierced the armor of indifference Thomas had built over the years. Every fiber of Thomas's being screamed at him to put the girls in his car, call the police and end this madness. But there was something stronger, a calling he couldn't ignore. "All right," he heard himself saying, "let's go take a look." Thomas scooped the girls into his arms, surprised at how light they were, almost ethereal. He began walking toward the plane, each step a battle against wind and snow. He could feel the cold penetrating to his bones, and he wondered how these fragile children had survived until now. As they approached, the details of the plane began to emerge. It was an old Boeing 727, probably from the 70s, its paint peeling and its windows coated in ice. The cabin door was ajar, swaying slightly in the wind, like a sinister invitation. Thomas hesitated at the entrance, the weight of the situation finally hitting him. What was he doing? Entering an abandoned airplane in the middle of a snowstorm, led by two mysterious children. It was insanity. But before he could reconsider, one of the girls wriggled out of his arms and went inside. Her sister followed immediately, leaving Thomas no choice but to go in after them. The interior of the plane was a world apart. The wind still howled outside, but here inside there was an eerie silence, broken only by the muffled sound of Thomas's footsteps. The air was heavy, with a pungent smell of mold and sickness. The girls led him through the narrow aisles, past rows of seats covered in dust and cobwebs. Thomas felt as if he were walking through a time tunnel, each step taking him deeper into a mystery he couldn't comprehend. Finally, they reached the rear of the plane. The twins stopped abruptly, pointing to a pile of old blankets in a corner. Thomas approached cautiously, his heart hammering in his chest. Someone was there, partially covered by the blankets. An elderly man, his breathing labored and uneven, echoed in the oppressive silence. When Thomas knelt beside him, the man opened his eyes. Recognition lit up his face for a moment before being replaced by an expression of pain and shame. "Mr. Bennett?" The voice was just a hoarse whisper, almost inaudible. Thomas felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. Those eyes, he knew them. Long-forgotten memories flooded his mind. Sunny afternoons in the mansion's garden, the smell of freshly pruned roses, laughter echoing among the trees. "Robert." Thomas could barely form the name, his throat suddenly dry. "Robert, what happened? What are you doing here?" The old gardener tried to speak, but was interrupted by a violent cough that shook his entire body. Thomas could hear the rattling in his lungs, a frightening sound that spoke of pneumonia and imminent danger. One of the twins approached, her small hand touching Thomas's arm. "Grandpa is sick," she said, her voice surprisingly clear and mature for someone so young, "for many days." Thomas looked at the girl, then back at Robert. The man he had known, the strong, skilled gardener who turned the Bennetts' estate into a green paradise, was almost unrecognizable now. His face was marked not only by time, but by a profound suffering Thomas could not comprehend. The questions piled up in Thomas's mind, each more urgent than the last. How had Robert ended up here? Why was he living in an abandoned plane with 2 little children? And why, in the name of everything sacred, had Thomas known nothing about this? But there was no time for questions now. Robert needed urgent medical help, and the girls. Thomas looked around, truly seeing for the first time the environment they were in. The interior of the plane was a nightmare of poverty and neglect. Food scraps, old clothes, and broken objects were piled on every surface. The air was heavy with the smell of sickness and despair. How could anyone live like this? How could children be raised in these conditions? Guilt hit Thomas like a wave, nearly knocking him off balance. He was one of the wealthiest men in the city. He lived in a luxury penthouse, dined at Michelin-starred restaurants, flew to Europe in his private jet on a whim. And here, just a few miles from his home, people he knew were living, no, surviving, in these inhuman conditions. "Mr. Bennett?" Robert's voice brought him back to the present. The old gardener was trying to sit up, his feverish eyes fixed on Thomas. "The girls, please take care of them." "Don't worry, Robert," Thomas said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'll take care of all of you. We'll get you out of here and to a hospital." But even as he spoke, Thomas knew it wouldn't be that simple. The storm outside still raged, making it almost impossible to get immediate help. And even if they managed to reach a hospital, what would happen afterward? Who would take care of the girls? How would they explain this bizarre situation to the authorities? Thomas looked at the twins, who were watching the scene with unsettling calm. There was something in their eyes, a wisdom beyond their years, that intrigued and frightened him at the same time. "What are your names?" he asked softly. The girls looked at each other before answering in unison. "Sophie and Claire." "Sophie and Claire," Thomas repeated, trying to smile despite the gravity of the situation. "You were very brave to ask for help. Now we need to be strong for your grandpa, okay?" The girls solemnly nodded, and Thomas felt a wave of determination wash over him. He didn't know how, but he was going to get these people out of this situation. He would fix whatever had gone wrong, make up for years of neglect. As he began to plan his next steps, Thomas couldn't help but wonder what exactly he had gotten himself into. This night, which had started like any other, had turned into something completely unexpected. And as the wind howled outside and Robert coughed weakly, Thomas had the distinct feeling that his life was about to change forever. The man who had entered that plane was not the same man who would leave it. The snow outside wasn't the only thing melting. The ice around Thomas Bennett's heart was also beginning to melt, drop by drop. The wail of the ambulance siren tore through the stormy night, competing with the relentless roar of the wind. Thomas Bennett stood at the entrance of the abandoned plane, his body acting as a shield against the whipping snow, while he watched the paramedics struggle to move the stretcher across the uneven ground. It had been a battle just to make the emergency call. The cell signal, usually impeccable, was spotty in the storm. Thomas had to shout the coordinates 3 times before the operator could grasp the bizarre situation. A critically ill man in an abandoned airplane during a snowstorm. Now watching Robert being carefully loaded into the ambulance, Thomas felt the weight of reality crash down on him. The old gardener's face was grey, his shallow, labored breaths echoing in the icy night. How had things come to this? "Sir?" One of the paramedics broke into his thoughts. "Are you riding with him?" Thomas hesitated, his gaze drifting to the 2 small figures huddled in the plane's entrance. Sophie and Claire, the mysterious twins, watched the scene with wide, frightened eyes. I can't," Thomas replied, feeling a pang of guilt. There are children I need to look after. The paramedic nodded, understanding. I see, we'll do our best for him, sir. Central Hospital if you want to visit him later. With one last look at Robert, the ambulance took off, its lights flashing furiously against the oppressive white of the snow. Thomas stood there for a moment, letting the cold seep into his bones before turning to the girls. Come on, little ones, he said, trying to sound reassuring. We can't stay here. The twins said nothing, but allowed Thomas to pick them up. The contrast between the warmth of their small bodies and the cutting chill of the night air was shocking. Fighting the wind, Thomas made his way back to his car. The trip to the Bennett mansion was tense and silent. The girls seated in the back looked like two motionless dolls, their eyes fixed on the snow-blurred landscape. Thomas watched them in the rearview mirror, a sense of unreality washing over him. Just hours ago he'd been worrying about financial reports, and now he was responsible for two orphaned children and a man on the verge of death. When they finally reached the imposing gates of the Bennett estate, Thomas felt a strange unease. The mansion, normally a symbol of his success and power, now felt cold and alienating. Well, here we are, he said, more to himself than to the girls as he parked in front of the house. Sophie and Claire remained motionless in the back seat, their wide eyes fixed on the mansion looming before them. Thomas opened the door for them, extending his hand. Shall we go inside? It's too cold out here. Slowly, almost hesitantly, the twins got out of the car. Their small steps were cautious, as if they feared the ground beneath them might suddenly vanish. Entering the mansion was like stepping into another world. The sudden warmth made the girls' cheeks flush, the contrast with the cold outside almost painful. Thomas watched as they looked around, their eyes traveling across the high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and artwork on the walls. "Margaret," Thomas called, his voice echoing in the foyer. A middle-aged woman in a spotless uniform appeared almost instantly. Her eyes widened at the sight of the two dripping, shivering girls by her employer. "Mr. Bennett, what—" "Margaret, this is Sophie and Claire," Thomas interrupted, suddenly feeling exhausted. "They'll be staying with us for a while. Could you please prepare the guest room and maybe find some dry clothes for them?" Margaret, always efficient, quickly got over her surprise. "Of course, sir. Come with me, dears. We'll get you warm and dry in no time." The twins looked to Thomas as if seeking permission. He nodded encouragingly, and they followed Margaret up the stairs, leaving small puddles of water in their wake. Alone in the foyer, Thomas finally allowed the tension of the night's events to hit him. He staggered into the living room and collapsed into a leather armchair. His gaze wandered over the expensive objects and framed photographs, now seeming to belong to another life. How had Robert ended up in that situation? The question pounded in his mind, insistent and painful. Thomas vaguely recalled having signed Robert's dismissal years ago, but the details were hazy. At the time, it seemed like just another document in a never-ending stack. The sound of light footsteps pulled him out of his thoughts. Sophie and Claire were back, now wearing pajamas clearly too large for them. Their hair was damp from the bath, and there was a healthy flush to their cheeks that hadn't been there before. "Hello," Thomas said softly. "Are you feeling better?" The girls nodded in unison, but remained silent. There was a hesitancy in their movements, as if they didn't quite know what to do or where to be in this strange, luxurious environment. "You must be hungry," Thomas went on, trying to fill the uncomfortable silence. "Margaret can make you something to eat. What would you like?" Sophie and Claire exchanged looks, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we see Grandpa?" The question hit Thomas like a punch in the stomach. How could he explain the seriousness of the situation to children so young? "Your grandpa, he needs to stay in the hospital for a while," Thomas answered carefully. "The doctors are taking care of him now. As soon as we can, we'll visit him, okay?" The girls nodded again, but Thomas could see the worry in their eyes. They seemed so small, so vulnerable at that moment, and Thomas felt a wave of protectiveness he hadn't known he was capable of. "Come on," he said, getting up. "Let's find you something to eat, and then we can all rest a bit. It's been a long night for all of us." As he led the twins to the kitchen, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about Robert, alone in the hospital. There were so many questions, so many mysteries to unravel. But for now, he had two frightened children to care for. Tomorrow, he promised himself. Tomorrow he would start investigating. He would find out what had happened to Robert, why he was living in that airplane, and how these two girls fit into the story. But for now, in the quiet of the night, with the snow falling softly outside, Thomas Bennett would do what he never imagined he would. Take care of two small lost souls, trying to be the safe harbor they so desperately needed. The cold morning light filtered through the windows of the Bennett mansion, finding Thomas already in his office, his tired eyes fixed on his computer screen. He hadn't slept much, his mind full of unanswered questions and images of the abandoned airplane. With a sigh, Thomas opened the human resources files. 5 years ago felt like a lifetime, but he was determined to discover what had really happened with Robert. Robert Peterson's file appeared on the screen, a photo of a younger, more vigorous man staring back at him. Thomas felt a twinge of guilt, realizing he would barely recognize this Robert if he saw him on the street today. Date of dismissal, October 15, 2020, Thomas muttered to himself. Reason, end of contract. Frowning, Thomas clicked for more details. Something didn't seem right. Robert had worked for the Bennett family for decades. Why would his contract simply be terminated? A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, without taking his eyes off the screen. Margaret, the housekeeper, entered quietly. "Mr. Bennett, the girls are awake. They're asking about their grandpa." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of responsibility. "Thank you, Margaret. I'll be there in a minute." When the door closed, Thomas turned his attention back to the file. Something was odd about the financial records from that period. Unusual payments, transfers that made no sense. He would need to dig deeper. Deciding to get some answers, Thomas left his office and headed to the mansion's service area. Some of the older staff might know something about Robert's departure. In the laundry room, he found Carlos, the driver who had worked for the family for nearly 2 decades. "Carlos," Thomas called, "may I speak with you for a moment?" Carlos seemed surprised to see his boss in that part of the house. "Of course, Mr. Bennett. What can I do for you?" "I'm trying to understand what happened with Robert Peterson, our former gardener. Do you remember anything about his departure 5 years ago?" The change in Carlos's demeanor was immediate and noticeable. His shoulders tensed and he avoided Thomas's gaze. "Ah, Mr. Peterson. Well, it was a long time ago, you know. I don't remember many details." Thomas narrowed his eyes. The evasiveness was obvious. "Carlos, this is important. Anything you can recall would be helpful." The driver hesitated, nervously jingling the keys in his pocket. "Look, Mr. Bennett, I don't want any trouble, but there were rumors, you know, about missing money, jewelry. I don't know the details, but things got weird around that time." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Missing jewelry? That would explain the financial irregularities he'd noticed. But Robert, the loyal Robert, stealing. Thanking Carlos, Thomas continued his investigation around the house. Each employee he spoke to seemed equally uncomfortable, offering fragments of information reluctantly. A story began to form, but it was riddled with holes and contradictions. Back in his office, Thomas delved into the financial records from that era. The more he dug, the more anomalies he found. Unauthorized transfers, records of jewelry sales that made no sense, suspicious payments. Hours passed without him noticing, until a shrill scream tore him from his concentration. Alarmed, Thomas ran into the hall, following the sound to the twins' bedroom. Sophie was sitting up in bed, trembling and crying, while Claire tried to comfort her. Margaret was already there, looking helpless. "What happened?" Thomas asked, approaching cautiously. Claire looked at him with frightened eyes. Sophie had a nightmare. She saw the bad man again. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, his heart aching at the terror in Sophie's eyes. "Which bad man, honey?" Sophie only shook her head, burying her face in her sister's shoulder. Claire, taking on the role of spokesperson, whispered, "The man who hurt Grandpa. He comes in our nightmares." Thomas exchanged a worried glance with Margaret. Clearly, these children carried deep trauma. "It's all right now," he said softly. "You're safe here. No one is going to hurt you." It took some time to calm Sophie down. Thomas stayed with them, telling stories and making promises of protection until both fell asleep again. When he finally left the room, he felt emotionally drained. "Mr. Bennett," Margaret called softly in the hallway, "there's something you should know. The girls, they refuse to go into certain rooms of the house. especially your old bedroom and Mrs. Victoria's closet." Thomas frowned. "My old bedroom, but why?" Margaret shook her head. "They won't say, they just go pale and start trembling if we try to take them near." Another mystery to add to the growing list. Thomas thanked Margaret and went back to his office, his mind spinning. Sitting at his desk, Thomas tried to piece together the puzzle. Robert accused of theft, suspicious financial records, missing jewelry. And now, two traumatized girls who feared certain areas of a house they had never been in before. Something didn't fit. The image of Robert that Thomas kept in his memories, the gentleman who tended the gardens with such care, did not match that of a thief. And why would he be living in squalor if he'd stolen valuable jewelry? Thomas opened a drawer of his desk, pulling out a bottle of whiskey and a glass. As he poured a drink, his eyes fell on a framed photo. He and Victoria, his ex-wife, smiling at a gala. The picture had been taken just before their tumultuous divorce, which coincided with Robert's departure. A disturbing thought began to form in Thomas's mind. What if Robert wasn't guilty? What if he had just been a convenient scapegoat? Thomas picked up the phone, dialing his lawyer's number. "Frank, it's Thomas Bennett. I need you to conduct a discreet investigation for me about the events leading up to Robert Peterson's dismissal 5 years ago." Hanging up, Thomas leaned back in his chair, the whiskey glass forgotten in his hand. He had the growing feeling he was only scratching the surface of something much bigger and darker. His gaze drifted to the window, where he could see the mansion's gardens. Gardens that Robert had lovingly cared for all those years. Gardens that, Thomas now realized, had never been the same since the old gardener's departure. "What really happened to you, Robert?" Thomas murmured to himself. "And how do these girls fit into all of this?" The sound of childish laughter echoed down the hall, a strange and almost alien sound in a house that had been devoid of joy for so long. Thomas got up, determined to spend more time with Sophie and Claire. Maybe, in their unguarded moments, the girls would let slip more clues about their mysterious past. As he walked toward the laughter, Thomas couldn't help but feel he was on the brink of a discovery that would change everything. The secrets of the past were about to surface, and he was determined to unravel them, whatever the cost. What Thomas did not know was that, in his search for answers, he was about to unearth secrets that some would prefer remain buried forever, and that the consequences of this investigation would be far deeper and more personal than he could ever have imagined. The afternoon sun filtered lazily through the heavy curtains of Thomas Bennett's office, casting elongated shadows over piles of old documents and files. He had been poring over dusty records for hours, searching for any clue that could shed light on the mystery surrounding Robert and the twins. With a sigh of frustration, Thomas leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. That was when he noticed a worn box shoved to the back of a tall shelf. Intrigued, he pulled it down, a cloud of dust dancing in the air. "Personal Files 1990-2000, read the faded label. Thomas opened the box, his heart pounding with anticipation. Among newspaper clippings and old documents, his fingers encountered something different, a photograph. And time had slightly yellowed the edges, but the image was still clear. In it, a younger Robert smiled broadly, his arm around the shoulders of a young woman. Their resemblance was unmistakable, the same warm eyes, the same gentle smile. This must be Robert's daughter. Thomas turned the photo over, finding a date and notation. Robert and Amanda, Spring Party, 1998. As he studied the image, something caught his attention. Amanda's features, the shape of her face, her delicate nose, even the way her hair fell, were uncannily familiar. With a jolt, Thomas realized she looked remarkably like Sophie and Claire. "My God," he murmured, the realization hitting him like a punch. The twins weren't just Robert's granddaughters, they were Amanda's daughters. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, still holding the photo. Sophie and Claire entered timidly, their small hands clasped together as always. Over the past few days, the girls had begun to venture more around the mansion, their curiosity slowly overshadowing their fear. "Mr. Thomas," Claire began, her voice still quiet but more confident than before, "can we go to the garden?" Thomas smiled, placing the photo carefully on his desk. "Of course, actually, I'd love to join you if you don't mind." The girl's eyes lit up at the suggestion, and Thomas felt a surge of affection that caught him by surprise. In such a short time, these children had found their way into his heart in a way he never imagined possible. As they walked through the mansion's extensive garden, Thomas watched the twins with new eyes, looking for traces of Amanda in every gesture and expression. The resemblance was undeniable, and he wondered how he hadn't noticed before. "Do you like flowers?" Thomas asked, stopping near a bed of roses. Sophie, usually the quieter one, answered with a shy smile. "Mommy loved roses. She said they were Grandpa's favorites." Thomas felt his heart constrict. It was the first time the girls had spontaneously mentioned their mother. "Really? Did you help your mother take care of the flowers?" Claire nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, Mommy taught us how to water the plants and pull out the weeds. She said it was important to take care of living things." Thomas knelt beside them, gently touching a rose petal. "Your mother sounded like a very wise woman. Do you remember anything else she liked to do?" The girls exchanged looks, as if deciding how much they could reveal. Finally, Sophie spoke. "She liked to sing to us before bed, and sometimes she cried looking at an old jewelry box." Thomas frowned, intrigued. "A jewelry box? Do you know why she was crying?" Claire shook her head. "She said it was because the jewelry reminded her of sad times, but we don't understand why pretty jewelry would make someone cry." Thomas nodded, his mind working quickly. There was a connection here, he could feel it. The stolen jewelry, Amanda's sadness, Robert's situation. They all seemed intertwined somehow. As the girls ran off to explore more of the garden, Thomas lingered behind, lost in thought. The weight of his past negligence hit him full force. How many lives had been affected by his lack of attention and care? His phone vibrated in his pocket, pulling him back to the present. It was a message from the hospital. Robert had awakened and was asking to see him. "Girls," Thomas called, "how about we go visit your grandpa at the hospital?" Sophie and Claire's faces lit up with hope and anxiety. "Really, can we?" "Of course," Thomas smiled, extending his hands to them. "Let's see how he's doing." During the drive to the hospital, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the photo and the girls' revelations. There were so many missing pieces in this puzzle, and he was determined to put them all together. In the hospital room, Robert looked frail against the white sheets, but his eyes lit up at the sight of his granddaughters. The girls ran to hug him, tears of relief in their eyes. "Mr. Bennett," Robert said, his voice hoarse, "thank you for taking care of them." Thomas stepped closer to the bed, feeling a mixture of guilt and determination. "There's no need to thank me. I'm so sorry for everything. There's so much I need to understand, so much to make right." Robert nodded slowly, weariness evident in his face. "There's much to tell, Mr. Bennett, but not here, not now." His eyes shifted to his granddaughters, a faint smile on his lips. "They're all I have left of Amanda. Please promise you'll protect them no matter what." The intensity in Robert's gaze caught Thomas by surprise. "I promise, Robert. I'll care for them as if they were my own daughters." As he watched Robert interact with the girls, Thomas felt a renewed determination take hold of him. He would get to the bottom of this story, uncover the secrets of the past, and do whatever it took to protect this family who had somehow become so important to him. What Thomas did not know was that his investigations were about to bring to light far darker secrets than he could imagine, and that a figure from the past was about to re-enter his life, bringing a storm of complications. Leaving the hospital that afternoon, with Sophie and Claire sleeping in the back seat, Thomas could not imagine that the real test of his promise was just beginning. The photo of Robert and Amanda weighed in his pocket, a silent reminder that the past is never truly buried, and that sometimes it resurfaces at the most unexpected moments. The shrill sound of the doorbell echoed through the Bennett mansion, breaking the quiet of the Sunday morning. Thomas, who was in the kitchen making pancakes for Sophie and Claire, frowned. He wasn't expecting visitors, especially not so early. "Margaret, could you get that, please?" he called, flipping another golden pancake in the skillet. Moments later, Margaret's voice rang out, tense and hesitant. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Victoria is here." The name hit Thomas like an electric shock. The spatula slipped from his hand, hitting the floor with a metallic clang. Sophie and Claire, seated at the kitchen table, exchanged anxious looks. "Victoria," Thomas murmured incredulously. His ex-wife, whom he hadn't seen in years, had chosen this moment to reappear. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Thomas turned to the girls. Stay here, all right? I'll be right back. In the foyer, Victoria stood waiting, as dazzling as Thomas remembered. Her platinum blonde hair fell in perfect waves over her shoulders, and her designer dress hugged her curves flawlessly. But there was something in her eyes, a mix of anxiety and calculation, that immediately put Thomas on alert. "Thomas, darling," Victoria smiled, stepping forward for a hug he deftly avoided. "It's been so long." "Victoria," Thomas replied coolly, "what are you doing here?" Her smile faltered for a moment. "Oh, can't I visit my ex-husband? I heard you've had an interesting week." Thomas felt his stomach sink. How did Victoria know about recent events? "I'm not sure what you're talking about," he said, keeping his voice neutral. Victoria laughed, a melodious sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Come now, Thomas, the whole city's talking. The mighty Thomas Bennet rescuing an old gardener and 2 orphaned children. It's almost like a modern fairy tale." Before Thomas could respond, a movement in the corner of his eye caught his attention. Sophie and Claire stood at the kitchen entrance, their small faces pale with fear. Victoria's smile widened at the sight of them. "Ah, so these are the famous twins. Hello, darlings. I'm Victoria, an old friend of Mr. Thomas." The girls did not respond. Instead, they shrank back, their wide eyes fixed on Victoria, as if they were seeing a ghost. Noticing the children's obvious panic, Thomas quickly positioned himself between them and Victoria. "I think you'd better leave, Victoria. This isn't a good time." "But I just got here," Victoria protested, her sugary tone contrasting with the hardness in her eyes. "Surely we have a lot to talk about, Thomas, about the past and the present." The veiled threat in her words did not go unnoticed. Thomas felt a wave of anger and protectiveness surge through him. "There's nothing to discuss. Please leave." For a moment, Victoria seemed ready to argue, but something in Thomas's determined expression made her back off. "Fine," she said, adjusting her designer bag on her shoulder. "But this isn't over, Thomas. We have unfinished business. You know that." With one last cryptic look at the twins, Victoria left, the sound of her high heels echoing on the marble floor. As soon as the door closed, Thomas turned to Sophie and Claire, who were still visibly trembling. He knelt in front of them, his eyes full of concern. "It's all right now. She's gone." Claire, always the braver of the two, spoke first. "She's the bad woman, Mr. Thomas. The one who hurt Grandpa." Thomas felt his heart race. "What do you mean, Claire? How did she hurt your grandpa?" But the girls had shut down again, their eyes lowered and lips sealed. Thomas knew it was no use pressing them now. Instead, he took them back to the kitchen, determined to restore some normalcy to the morning. As he watched them eat their pancakes in silence, Thomas's mind churned. The twins' reaction to Victoria was visceral, unmistakable. And Claire's words. They confirmed his growing suspicions that Victoria was at the center of this entire mystery. Remembering something, Thomas excused himself and hurried to his office. There he opened a locked drawer and took out a file he hadn't looked at in years, the report on the family jewel's disappearance. Flipping through the pages, his eyes widened. How had he not seen this before? The dates lined up perfectly. The disappearance of the jewelry, Robert's abrupt departure, the start of his marriage troubles with Victoria. One detail in particular caught his attention. A statement from Victoria claiming she had seen Robert acting suspiciously near the safe days before the theft. At the time, Thomas hadn't questioned it. He'd trusted Victoria implicitly. Now, looking back, he wondered how he could have been so blind. The sound of children's laughter brought him back to the present. Returning to the kitchen, Thomas found Sophie and Claire playing with Margaret, their previous fears seemingly forgotten. The scene warmed his heart, but also strengthened his resolve. He needed to find out the truth, not just for Robert or himself, but for these 2 innocent children who had in some way become the center of his world. Thomas knew the next steps would be dangerous. Victoria was not an adversary to be underestimated. She had connections, influence, and apparently secrets that could destroy lives. But as he watched Sophie and Claire, Thomas felt a courage he hadn't known he possessed. He would get to the bottom of this story, no matter the cost. He would protect these children and seek justice for Robert, even if it meant facing the demons of his own past. Victoria's unexpected visit had made one thing clear. The game had begun. And Thomas was determined not to lose this time. Thomas Bennet's office was shrouded in darkness, illuminated only by the blue light of his laptop, and the occasional glow of his phone. He had been poring over bank records, police reports, and old correspondence for hours, looking for anything that could link Victoria to the jewelry theft. His eyes burned with fatigue, but he didn't dare stop. Every new piece of information he uncovered left him more disturbed and more determined to find the truth. "Mr. Bennet," Margaret's voice startled him. She stood at the door, a worried expression on her face. "You've been in here since last night. Don't you think you should get some rest?" Thomas rubbed his eyes, surprised to see it was already morning. "I'm fine, Margaret. I just need more coffee." The housekeeper hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but opting instead to nod and leave. Moments later, she returned with a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of toast. "The girls are almost ready for school," she informed him as she set the coffee down. "They seem nervous." Thomas felt a pang of guilt. In his obsession with the investigation, he had neglected Sophie and Claire these past few days. "Thank you, Margaret. I'll go down to see them before they leave." In the kitchen, he found the twins seated at the table, unenthusiastically stirring their cereal. Both wore the uniforms of the prestigious private school Thomas had enrolled them in, but they looked small and vulnerable in their new outfits. "Good morning, girls," Thomas said, forcing a cheerful smile. "Ready for the big day?" Sophie and Claire exchanged anxious glances, before Claire answered, "Do we really have to go, Mr. Thomas? Can't we stay here with you?" The request broke Thomas's heart. He knelt between the girls' chairs, looking into their eyes. "I know it's scary, but I promise it'll be all right. School is a wonderful place to learn and make new friends." "What if the bad woman shows up there?" Sophie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. The bad woman could only be Victoria. "That won't happen," he assured them, though part of him wondered if he could truly guarantee it. "School is safe, and I'll pick you up myself at the end of the day." The girls didn't seem entirely convinced, but they reluctantly nodded. Thomas accompanied them to the car, watching as Margaret helped them with their seatbelts. As the car pulled away, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing them somehow. But he knew that finding out the truth was the only way to really keep them safe. Back in his office, Thomas resumed his investigation with renewed vigor. Then he found something that made his heart race: a bank statement for a secret account in Victoria's name, dated a few days before the jewelry theft. The account showed a series of substantial deposits from a company called Starlight Enterprises. Thomas had never heard of it, but the timing of the deposits was highly suspicious. As he dug deeper into Starlight Enterprises, his phone rang. It was the hospital. Robert had asked to see him. Thomas arrived at the hospital with his mind still full of his recent discoveries. He found Robert sitting up in bed, looking stronger than at their last visit, though still noticeably worn. "Mr. Bennet," Robert greeted him, his voice husky but firm. "Thank you for coming." Thomas sat beside the bed, noticing the serious expression on the former gardener's face. "How are you feeling, Robert?" "I'm better," Robert replied. "But I didn't call you here to talk about my health. It's time you knew the truth, Mr. Bennet. About Amanda, about the girls, about everything." Thomas felt his heart accelerate. "I'm listening, Robert." Robert closed his eyes for a moment, as if summoning strength. When he opened them again, they were filled with an old pain. "Amanda, my daughter, she worked as a nurse here in this hospital. She was dedicated, loved her job, but then she got sick." Thomas nodded encouragingly, afraid to interrupt the flow of memories. "It all happened so fast," Robert continued, his voice breaking. "One day she was fine, the next, the diagnosis was devastating. She needed expensive experimental treatment. I didn't have the money." Thomas felt a surge of guilt. He vaguely remembered Robert asking for a large advance years ago, something he had refused without a second thought. "I begged for help, Mr. Bennet. I asked Mrs. Victoria, I asked you, but no one seemed to hear me. And then the jewelry disappeared. Suddenly I was the prime suspect. I was forced to leave, with no references, nothing." Thomas could barely breathe. "Robert, I didn't know. I'm so sorry." Robert shook his head sadly. "Amanda died 2 weeks later. She left the twins who had just been born. I took them in. They were all I had left of her." The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place for Thomas, forming a horrifying picture of negligence and injustice. "The girls," Thomas said softly. "They mentioned a bad woman. They were talking about Victoria?" Robert's face hardened. "Mrs. Victoria. She came to see me right after Amanda died. She said she knew I hadn't stolen the jewelry, but if I ever tried to clear my name, she'd do something terrible to the girls. I couldn't risk it, Mr. Bennett. They were all I had." Thomas felt a wave of fury wash over him. Victoria hadn't just orchestrated the theft. She had threatened innocent children to cover up her crimes. "Robert," Thomas said, his voice trembling with emotion, "I promise you I'll fix this. I'll clear your name and make sure you and the girls are safe." Robert nodded wearily. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. I just want Sophie and Claire to have a better life." Leaving the hospital, Thomas felt emotionally drained but more determined than ever. He needed to talk to the twins, hear their version of the story. Arriving home, he found Sophie and Claire in the garden with Margaret. The girls looked tense, and Thomas immediately knew something had happened at school. "How was your first day?" he asked gently, sitting down with them on the grass. Claire bit her lip before answering. "It was different. The other kids asked a lot of questions about our mom, about where we lived before." Sophie, always quieter, just nodded, her eyes on the ground. Thomas's heart ached. "You don't have to talk about anything you don't want to, okay? But if you ever want to talk to me about your mom or anything else, I'm here to listen." The girls exchanged a look, seeming to hold a silent conversation. Finally, Sophie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom used to sing to us every night. She said the stars were angels watching over us." Claire continued, "And she made the best hot chocolate in the world. She always put extra marshmallows for us." Thomas smiled encouragingly, noticing how the girls' eyes lit up when they talked about their mother. "She sounds like she was a wonderful mother." "She was," Claire said, her voice growing sad. "But then she got sick and everything changed." Thomas hesitated, not wanting to push too hard but needing to know. "What changed, sweetheart?" Sophie replied this time, "Grandpa was always sad. Mom cried a lot, and then the bad woman came." Thomas felt his heart rate spike. "This bad woman? Did she look like the lady who came here the other day?" The twins nodded in unison, their eyes wide with fear. "She yelled at Grandpa," Claire went on, "said bad things about Mommy, and then Mommy left forever." Thomas struggled against the tears threatening to fall. The cruelty of Victoria, the tragedy that had befallen this family, all because of his own negligence and blindness. "Sophie, Claire," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm so sorry for what happened to you and your family. I promise I'll do everything I can to make things right." The girls looked at him with a mix of hope and caution. Thomas knew he had a long way to go to earn their complete trust, but he was determined to try. That night, after putting the twins to bed, Thomas returned to his office. The day's revelations weighed on his mind, fueling his determination. He opened his laptop, determined to dig deeper into Starlight Enterprises and its connection to Victoria. As he scoured corporate records and financial transactions, a pattern began to emerge. Starlight wasn't just any company. It was a front for a money laundering operation, and Victoria was at the center of it all. Thomas leaned back in his chair, the realization hitting him full force. His ex-wife wasn't just a thief, she was involved in something much bigger and much more dangerous. Picking up his phone, Thomas dialed his lawyer's number. "Frank, it's Thomas. I need you to gather all the evidence we have against Victoria. It's time to put an end to this once and for all." As he hung up, Thomas looked at the photo of Robert and Amanda on his desk. "I'll fix this," he vowed quietly. "For you, for Sophie and Claire, for all of us." The road ahead would be hard and dangerous, Thomas knew that, but for the first time in years, he felt he was doing the right thing. And no matter the cost, he would see it through to the end. Outside, the night was clear, the stars shining brightly. Thomas wondered if, as Amanda used to tell her daughters, there really were angels watching over them. And if there were, he hoped they would be on his side in the battle that was about to begin. The morning sun had barely broken over the horizon when Thomas Bennett parked his car in front of a modest house in the city suburbs. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The woman who lived here, Martha Stevens, had been a housekeeper at the Bennett mansion for over 3 decades, before abruptly retiring soon after the jewelry incident. Thomas stepped out of the car and walked to the door, hesitating a moment before ringing the bell. Seconds later, a gray-haired woman with shrewd eyes answered. "Mr. Bennett?" Martha asked, clear surprise in her voice. "What brings you here so early?" "Good morning, Martha," Thomas replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I really need to talk to you. It's about what happened 5 years ago." Martha's face visibly paled, but she nodded and opened the door wider. "Come in, sir. I guess this talk is long overdue." In the small living room, Thomas sat uncomfortably on a worn sofa. Martha settled into an armchair across from him, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. "Martha," Thomas began, "I know I asked everyone not to talk about the jewelry incident, but now I need the truth. What really happened that night?" Martha closed her eyes for a moment, as though gathering courage. When she opened them again, they were filled with a determination that surprised Thomas. "Mr. Bennett, what I'm about to tell you will change everything you believe you know about that night," she said, her voice firm. "Robert Peterson was innocent. It was Mrs. Victoria who orchestrated everything." Thomas felt as if he'd been punched, even though he already suspected this truth. "How do you know that, Martha?" "I saw it," she answered simply. "On the night of the supposed theft, I was making my usual nightly rounds. I saw Mrs. Victoria leaving the master bedroom with a small suitcase. She looked nervous, glancing around like she was afraid of being seen." Martha paused, her eyes distant as if reliving the scene. "The next day when the theft was discovered, I was shocked to see Mrs. Victoria accusing Robert so vehemently. She even found one of the jewels in his quarters." "And you didn't say anything?" Thomas asked, a hint of accusation in his voice. Martha lowered her eyes, ashamed. "I tried, Mr. Bennett. I came to you, remember, but Mrs. Victoria intercepted our conversation. After that, she threatened me, said if I spoke up, she'd make my grandson lose the scholarship you had granted him." Thomas leaned back in the sofa, stunned. He vaguely remembered Martha trying to talk to him at the time, but he'd been so consumed by anger and disappointment with Robert that he hadn't listened. "Martha, I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick. "I should have listened to you." The former housekeeper nodded sadly. "The past can't be changed, Mr. Bennett, but maybe there's still time to do the right thing now." Thomas agreed, a firm resolve growing within him. "Would you be willing to testify about what you saw, Martha?" "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "I've carried this burden for far too long." Thanking Martha and promising to keep in touch, Thomas left the house with his mind in overdrive. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, but the picture they formed was darker than he could ever have imagined. Back at the mansion, Thomas found Robert in the garden, supervising Sophie and Claire as they watered the flowers. The domestic scene sharply contrasted with the morning's troubling revelations. "Robert," Thomas called softly, not wanting to startle the girls, "can we talk?" The former gardener nodded, telling his granddaughters to continue their work. He followed Thomas to a nearby bench, his movement still slow from his recent hospital stay. "I spoke to Martha Stevens today," Thomas began, watching Robert's reaction. "She told me what really happened on the night of the theft." Robert closed his eyes, a mixture of relief and pain crossing his face. "So now you know." "Yes," Thomas replied, guilt evident in his voice. "Robert, I have no words to express how sorry I am. My blindness, my trust in Victoria. It cost you and your family so much." Robert shook his head slowly. "Mr. Bennett, it's not all your fault. I should have fought harder, should have insisted on my innocence. But after Amanda died, I just wanted to protect the girls." "Tell me what happened," Thomas asked gently. "Please, I need to hear it from you." Robert took a deep breath, his gaze drifting to his granddaughters laughing among the flowers. "After I was accused of stealing, Mrs. Victoria came to see me. She told me she knew I was innocent, but that if I tried to prove it, she'd do something terrible to Sophie and Claire." Thomas felt a wave of fury surge through him. "She threatened children?" Robert nodded sadly. "I couldn't risk it. They had already lost their mother. I was all they had. So I accepted the dismissal, took what little I had, and left." "How did you end up living in that abandoned plane?" Thomas asked, recalling the shocking scene from weeks ago. "It was hard to find work after being accused of theft," Robert explained. "I spent all my savings on Amanda's treatment and taking care of the girls. The plane, well, it was the only place we could stay without being bothered." Thomas felt his heart clench. The injustice of it all was overwhelming. "Robert, I promise you I will fix this. I'll clear your name and make sure you and the girls have everything you need." At that moment, Sophie and Claire approached, their small faces serious. "Mr. Thomas," Claire said, her voice surprisingly firm for someone so young. "We heard you talking about the bad woman." Thomas exchanged a worried glance with Robert before kneeling to their level. "Yes, sweetheart, we were talking about some things that happened in the past." Sophie, usually the quieter one, stepped forward. "We remember her. She came to the plane once when she thought Grandpa wasn't there." Thomas and Robert immediately snapped to attention. "What happened?" Thomas asked gently. "She was looking for something," Claire continued. "She kept going through Mummy's things, the old boxes. And she got really mad when she couldn't find it," Sophie added, her voice barely a whisper. "She said Grandpa would regret it if he didn't hand it over." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. What was Victoria looking for? What could be so important that she would repeatedly threaten Robert and the girls? Robert looked equally perplexed. "I didn't know about this," he said, pulling his granddaughters close. "Why didn't you tell me, little ones?" "We were scared," Claire answered, tears glistening in her eyes. "She said bad things would happen if we told anyone." Thomas felt a wave of protectiveness wash over him. He stood up, a new determination in his eyes. "Nothing bad will happen to you," he promised. "I won't let it." Turning to Robert, Thomas went on, "We need to go through everything Amanda left behind. There must be something there, some clue about what Victoria is after." Robert nodded, a spark of hope lighting his tired eyes. "There are a few boxes I never opened, personal things of Amanda's. Maybe there's something there." As he watched Robert comfort the twins, Thomas felt the full weight of his responsibility. He wasn't just uncovering a crime from the past. He was protecting the future of these innocent children. The truth was finally coming to light, but Thomas knew the worst was yet to come. Victoria wouldn't give up easily, and he needed to be ready for whatever she had planned. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Thomas stayed up in his office reviewing every detail he had uncovered. The stolen jewelry, the threats, the mysterious item Victoria was after. It was all connected somehow. As the night wore on, Thomas made a silent promise to himself, to Robert, to Amanda, and most of all to Sophie and Claire. He would see this through, no matter the cost. The truth would be revealed, and justice would finally be done. The next step was clear. It was time to confront Victoria directly. With the evidence he had gathered, and the testimonies of Martha and the twins, Thomas finally felt ready to face his ex-wife and expose her crimes. Tomorrow, Thomas thought as he finally prepared to sleep, would be the day everything changed, the day Victoria's scheme finally crumbled. The law firm of Goldstein & Associates occupied the entire 20th floor of a skyscraper downtown. Thomas Bennett adjusted his tie as the elevator rose, his heart pounding against his chest. Beside him, Frank Goldstein, his longtime lawyer, was reviewing the documents in his briefcase. "Are you sure you want to do this, Thomas?" Frank asked, casting a worried look at his client. "Once we start, there's no going back." Thomas nodded firmly. "It's time to correct my mistakes, Frank, no matter the cost." The elevator doors opened onto an elegant reception area. The receptionist led them to a conference room where Victoria was already waiting, accompanied by her own lawyer. Victoria smiled when she saw Thomas, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Thomas, darling, what a pleasant surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Thomas took a seat across from her, placing a thick folder on the table. "It's over, Victoria. I know everything." Victoria's smile faltered for an instant, but she quickly recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about." Frank opened the folder, spreading documents and photographs on the table. "Mrs. Bennett, we have solid evidence of your involvement in the Bennett family jewelry theft 5 years ago, as well as financial fraud and blackmail." Victoria visibly paled, her eyes darting quickly over the documents. Thomas could see panic rising in her gaze. "This is ridiculous," she tried to argue, but her voice trembled. "Thomas, you can't believe this." "I have Martha Stevens's testimony," Thomas said calmly. "She saw you that night, Victoria, and Robert's granddaughters. They remember you threatening their grandfather." Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly on the floor. "This is absurd. I won't stay here listening to these baseless accusations." She turned to leave, but found 2 police officers blocking the door. Thomas hadn't wanted to go this far, but he knew it was necessary. "Mrs. Victoria Bennett," one of the officers began, "you are under arrest for the theft of family jewelry, financial fraud, and blackmail." What followed was a whirlwind of activity. Victoria screamed and struggled as she was handcuffed. Her lawyer demanded to see a warrant, and Frank calmly presented all the necessary documentation. Thomas watched the scene with a mix of relief and sadness. This woman whom he had once loved, whom he thought he knew so well, had caused so much suffering to so many people. Hours later, Thomas stood before a crowd of reporters outside the police station. Flashes went off incessantly, and microphones were thrust toward him. "Mr. Bennett," one reporter shouted, "is it true your ex-wife was arrested for a crime committed 5 years ago?" Thomas took a deep breath before answering. "Yes, it's true. Victoria Bennett was arrested today in connection with the theft of family jewelry and related crimes." "What about the accusations against Robert Peterson, your former gardener?" another journalist asked. "Robert Peterson is completely innocent," Thomas declared firmly. "He was wrongly accused, and I made a terrible mistake by not investigating properly at the time." Thomas paused, gathering the courage for what he would say next. "In fact, I'd like to take this opportunity to make a public apology to Robert Peterson, to his family, and to everyone who was affected by my negligence and blindness." A murmur ran through the crowd of reporters. Thomas continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I failed not only as an employer but as a human being. My indifference and misplaced trust caused years of suffering for innocent people. Robert lost his job, his reputation, and nearly lost everything. His daughter died without receiving the medical treatment she needed, leaving 2 orphaned girls." Thomas paused, swallowing hard. "I can't change the past, but I'm committed to doing what I can to right these wrongs. Robert Peterson will receive substantial financial compensation, and I'm establishing a fund to ensure his granddaughters have access to the best education and medical care possible." The reporters began shouting questions over one another, but Thomas raised a hand asking for silence. This situation has brought to light important issues about social inequality and injustice in our community. As someone in a position of privilege and power, I recognize my responsibility to address these issues. I'll be working with local organizations to develop programs to help families in similar situations. As Thomas continued answering questions, the news spread quickly. In a small apartment across the city, Robert watched the press conference on television, silent tears rolling down his cheeks. Sophie and Claire, seated beside him, gazed at the screen with a mix of confusion and hope. Back at the Bennett mansion, hours later, Thomas found Robert and the girls waiting for him. The former gardener stood when Thomas entered, his eyes red but filled with an emotion Thomas couldn't fully decipher. "Mr. Bennett," Robert began, his voice hoarse, I don't know what to say." Thomas shook his head, tears glistening in his own eyes. "Don't say anything, Robert. I'm the one who should apologize. What I did today, it's just the beginning of how I plan to make amends." Robert extended his hand, and Thomas grasped it firmly. In that handshake, years of misunderstanding, pain, and regret seemed to begin to dissolve. Sophie and Claire watched with wide eyes. Thomas knelt to their level. "Girls," he said gently, "I know you've been through a lot of hard things, but I promise that from now on, I'll do whatever I can to make sure you have a happy and safe life." The twins exchanged a glance before, surprisingly, stepping forward to hug Thomas. He wrapped his arms around them, feeling a wave of protection and affection he had never experienced before. In the days that followed, the story dominated local and even national headlines. Billionaire exposes ex-wife's fraud scheme. Innocent gardener finally vindicated. The high cost of the rich's indifference. The headlines varied, but the impact was undeniable. Thomas kept his word. Robert received financial compensation that would guarantee comfort for him and his granddaughters for the rest of their lives. The twins were enrolled in an excellent school and began receiving the psychological support they needed to deal with their traumas. The Bennett mansion, once a symbol of isolation and privilege, became a hive of activity. Thomas opened its doors to charitable organizations, offering space for meetings and benefit events. The garden, once again under Robert's care, flourished like never before, turning into a refuge of beauty and peace. One afternoon, as Thomas watched Sophie and Claire playing happily in the garden, Robert joined him. "You know, Mr. Bennett," Robert said pensively, "for years I carried so much anger and bitterness, I thought I'd never be able to forgive. But seeing what you've done, how you've changed, I realize that forgiveness isn't just possible, it's necessary. Thomas felt a lump in his throat. Thank you, Robert. That means more to me than you can imagine. They fell silent for a moment, watching the girls laugh and run among the flowers. They look so happy now, Thomas remarked. Robert nodded, a gentle smile on his lined face. Yes, they do, but... He hesitated, a worried look crossing his features. What is it? Thomas asked, immediately alert. Robert sighed deeply. It's just that, well, there's something I didn't tell you about the girl's father. Thomas felt a wave of apprehension. Their father? I thought he wasn't in the picture. He wasn't, Robert confirmed. But I received a letter yesterday. Paul, the girl's father, he's getting out of prison, and he wants to see his daughters. Thomas was silent, processing the information. Just when things seemed to be settling, a new complication loomed on the horizon. What do you think about that, Robert? Thomas asked carefully. Robert looked at his granddaughters, his face a mix of emotions. Honestly, Mr. Bennett, I'm not sure. Paul made mistakes, but he is their father. Maybe he deserves a chance to be part of their lives. Thomas nodded slowly. Well, whatever happens, we'll face it together. The girls are our priority now. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Thomas couldn't help reflecting on how his life had changed in the last few weeks. From a cold, distant man, focused solely on business and success, he had become someone deeply involved in the lives of Robert, Sophie, and Claire. The future was still uncertain, with Paul's impending arrival and the challenges it might bring, but Thomas was determined to face whatever came his way, no longer alone, but as part of this new and unlikely family fate had given him. Justice had been served, and remorse had given way to redemption. Now it was time to look to the future and build something new from the ruins of the past. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden of the Bennett mansion, where Thomas watched Sophie and Claire playing happily among the flowers. Several weeks had passed since that fateful snowy night, but seeing the twins finally relaxed and joyful brought a smile to his face. Robert stood beside him, carefully pruning a rosebush. The former gardener, now reinstated to his old position, seemed more at peace than Thomas had ever seen him. They look so different now, don't they? Thomas commented, nodding toward the girls. Robert nodded, a gentle smile on his wrinkled face. It's amazing what a little security and love can do. The moment of tranquility was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Thomas frowned, not expecting anyone. I'll get it, he said to Robert, who looked equally intrigued. Walking to the front door, Thomas straightened his shirt and opened it. The man standing on the threshold took him completely by surprise. He was tall and lean, with short, dark hair close to his scalp. His deep blue eyes were unsettlingly familiar. He wore faded jeans and a simple shirt, carrying a worn backpack over one shoulder. Mr. Bennett, the man asked, his voice rough and hesitant. Thomas nodded slowly, a sinking feeling forming in his stomach. Yes, that's me, and you are... I'm Paul Peterson, the man replied, extending a trembling hand. I'm Sophie and Claire's father. Thomas felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. He'd been informed of Paul's release, of course, but hadn't expected him to show up so suddenly. Paul, Thomas managed to say, mechanically shaking the offered hand. Please come in. Leading Paul into the living room, Thomas struggled to gather his thoughts. How was he supposed to handle this situation? How would the girls react? Robert, Thomas called, his voice louder than he intended. Could you come here for a moment? Seconds later, Robert entered the room, freezing at the sight of Paul. The two men stared at each other for a long moment, a flood of emotions crossing their faces. Dad, Paul finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert took a hesitant step forward. Pauline, I didn't know you'd be here so soon. I know, I should have let you know, Paul replied, running a hand over his short hair. But I needed to see the girls. As if summoned by his words, Sophie and Claire appeared in the doorway, their eyes wide with curiosity. Upon seeing Paul, they stopped abruptly, clinging to each other. Paul turned slowly, tears filling his eyes at the sight of his daughters. Sophie, Claire? He called softly, taking a step toward them. The twins recoiled instinctively, looking to Robert for guidance. It's all right, little ones, Robert said, his voice trembling. This is your father. A tense silence fell over the room. Thomas watched, feeling like an intruder in a deeply private moment. Finally, Claire, always the braver one, took a small step forward. "You're our dad?" she asked, her voice a mix of fear and curiosity. Paul knelt, meeting the girls at eye level. "Yes, that's me," he answered gently. "I know you probably don't remember me, but I've thought about you every single day." Sophie, still half hidden behind her sister, spoke for the first time. "Why did you never come see us?" The question, so innocent and yet so loaded, seemed to hit Paul like a physical blow. He closed his eyes for a moment, visibly struggling to keep his composure. "I wanted to more than anything in the world," he finally replied. "But I made a mistake, a very big mistake, and I had to be away because of it." Thomas gently intervened, sensing the children needed time to process. "Girls, how about you go play in the garden for a while? We grown-ups need to talk, and then we can all talk together. What do you think?" The twins nodded hesitantly, casting curious glances at Paul before leaving. Once alone, Paul collapsed into a nearby armchair, covering his face with his hands. "They don't even recognize me," he murmured, the pain obvious in his voice. Robert approached, placing a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. "They were very young when everything happened. Give them time." Thomas sat down, sensing it was time to hear the whole story. "Paul," he began gently, "I think we'd all like to hear what happened. If you feel comfortable sharing, of course." Paul looked up, his eyes red but determined. "Yes, you all deserve to know, every bit of it." He took a deep breath before continuing. "When Amanda got sick, I was desperate. The treatment was expensive, far beyond what we could afford. I tried everything, overtime, loans, even asking friends and family. But it wasn't enough." He paused, guilt written all over his face. "So I did something stupid, really stupid. There was this guy at work who always talked about how easy it was to make quick money by hacking bank systems. I never considered it before, but at that time, it felt like the only way." Thomas and Robert listened closely, their expressions a mixture of compassion and shock. "I got the money," Paul went on, his voice breaking. "But before I could use it for Amanda's treatment, I was caught. It all happened so fast. The arrest, the trial. Amanda got worse quickly, and I didn't even get to say goodbye to her." Tears now streamed freely down Paul's face. Robert, his eyes also brimming with tears, squeezed his son's shoulder in silent support. "I spent 5 years in prison," Paul concluded. 5 years thinking about my daughters, about everything I'd lost. When I got out, I just wanted to see them, to know they were okay." A heavy silence fell over the room after Paul's account. Thomas was the first to break it. "Dear Paul," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I can't imagine what you went through, what all of you went through, but I want you to know I'm willing to do whatever I can to help reunite your family." Paul looked at Thomas with a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Mr. Bennett, after everything that's happened, why would you help us?" Thomas felt the weight of his own past mistakes. "Because I made mistakes too, Paul. My negligence and blindness caused your family suffering. Helping now is the least I can do to try and make it right." Robert, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. "Son, these last years weren't easy, taking care of the girls alone, especially after losing Amanda. There were times I thought I wouldn't make it." Paul hung his head, guilt evident in his posture. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I should have been here." "What matters is that you're here now," Robert replied, his voice firm but kind. "The girls need their father, and I need my son back." The sound of childish laughter from the garden drew everyone's attention. Through the window, they could see Sophie and Claire playing, oblivious to the intense conversation inside. "What are they like?" Paul asked softly, his eyes on his daughters. Thomas smiled, remembering how the twins had blossomed over the past few weeks. "They're amazing, Paul. Smart, brave, and with huge hearts. Sophie is quieter, always taking everything in. Claire's the adventurer, always ready for a new challenge. They remind me so much of Amanda," Robert added, a sad smile on his face. Paul nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "I've missed so much. Will they ever accept me as their father?" "Give them time," Thomas advised, "and yourself as well. Rebuilding relationships takes time, but with patience and love, it's possible." Just then, the twins ran into the living room, stopping abruptly at the sight of the adults in serious conversation. "Is everything okay?" Claire asked, her gaze moving between her grandfather and the father she barely knew. Robert smiled reassuringly. "Yes, sweetheart. Actually, how about we all sit down together? I think it's time for a family talk. The girls settled hesitantly on the sofa, Paul sitting in a nearby armchair, visibly nervous. Sophie, Claire, Robert began softly, you remember how we told you about your mother, how she got sick? The twins nodded solemnly. Well, Robert continued, at the time your father, Paul here, did something to try to help your mother. Something he shouldn't have done, but he did it out of love for her and for you. Paul leaned forward, his voice trembling but determined. I made a mistake, girls, a big mistake that took me away from you for a long time, but I want you to know there wasn't a single day I didn't think about you. Wish I could be here. Sophie and Claire listened intently, their young faces filled with confusion and curiosity. Are you going away again? Sophie asked quietly, her voice laced with fear. Paul shook his head emphatically. No, honey, never again. If you'll let me, I want to be here. I want to know you, to be the father you deserve. Claire, always direct, asked the question on her mind. Do you love us, even if you don't know us well? Paul felt his heart clench at the innocent yet profound question. I love you more than anything in this world, he answered, his voice thick with emotion. From the moment you were born, you were the center of my world, and even in the years I was away, that love never went away. The twins exchanged looks, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, to everyone's surprise, they stepped forward hesitantly toward Paul. Can we hug you? Claire asked timidly. Paul opened his arms, tears streaming freely down his face. Nothing would make me happier. The hug that followed was awkward and hesitant at first, but soon turned into something deep and emotional. Paul held his daughters, silently sobbing as he embraced them for the first time in years. Thomas and Robert watched, deeply moved. It was the start of a journey that would be long and sometimes difficult, but it was a start filled with hope. When the hug finally ended, Sophie looked at Thomas with serious eyes. Mr. Thomas, is Daddy going to live here with us? The question took Thomas by surprise. He glanced at Robert, seeking guidance. Robert cleared his throat, clearly emotional. Well, that's something we need to discuss as a family. What do you girls think? Claire nodded enthusiastically. Yes, then we can get to know Daddy better. Paul looked overwhelmed at the suggestion. I don't want to impose, Mr. Bennett. You've already done so much for us. Thomas raised a hand, cutting him off. Paul, this house is far too big for one person anyway. If everyone agrees, I'd be happy to have you stay here for as long as necessary. Gratitude shone in Paul's eyes. Thank you, Mr. Bennett. I promise I'll do my best to make up for your generosity. No need to repay anything, Thomas replied sincerely. Helping your family reunite and heal, that's more than enough. As night fell over the Bennett mansion, a sense of new beginnings filled the air. Paul, sitting on the living room floor, listened intently as Sophie and Claire told him excitedly about their lives, their interests, their hopes. Robert watched the scene with a mix of joy and nostalgia, thinking of Amanda and how she would have loved to see this moment. And Thomas, watching from a corner of the room, felt a deep sense of purpose. The road ahead would be challenging, full of adjustments and difficult moments, but seeing the Peterson family begin to reconnect, he knew he had done the right thing. As he prepared for bed that night, Thomas reflected on how his life had changed in the last few weeks. From a lonely man focused solely on business, he had become an integral part of a family in the midst of rebuilding. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Thomas faced it with hope and determination. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities for healing and redemption. And so, under the roof of the Bennett mansion, an unlikely family was beginning to take shape, united by adversity, by forgiveness, and by the promise of a fresh start. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee hung in the mansion's kitchen as Thomas descended the stairs, surprised to find Paul already awake and busy. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," Paul greeted, a hesitant smile on his tired face. "Hope you don't mind, I wanted to feel useful." Thomas returned the smile, noticing the dark circles under Paul's eyes. "Not at all, and please call me Thomas." As they sipped their coffee, Thomas observed the younger man. In the 2 weeks since his arrival, Paul had worked tirelessly to readjust to life outside prison and, most importantly, reconnect with his daughters. "How are things going with the girls?" Thomas asked gently. Paul sighed, his expression a mix of hope and frustration. "It's complicated. Sometimes I feel like we're making progress, Other times, it's like I'm a complete stranger to them. Thomas nodded sympathetically. It takes time, Paul. They've spent most of their lives without you. Trust has to be rebuilt gradually. At that moment, Robert entered the kitchen, his gaze shifting between his son and Thomas. The subtle tension between father and son was palpable, a reminder that it wasn't just Paul's relationship with the twins that needed mending. "Paul," Thomas began, deciding to bring up an important topic, "I've been thinking about your employment situation. I have some contacts who might be able to help." Paul's eyes lit up with hope. "Really? I'd be very grateful. It's been tough to find something with my record." Thomas offered an encouraging smile. "I have a friend who runs a tech company. He believes in second chances and is always looking for programming talent." Robert watched the exchange with a mix of gratitude and concern. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Bennett. But Paul, are you sure you're ready?" The unspoken weight of the question hung in the air. Paul squared his shoulders, meeting his father's gaze. "I'm ready, Dad. I need to do this. For the girls, for myself. I need to prove I can be the man and father they deserve." The sound of small footsteps interrupted the conversation. Sophie and Claire entered the kitchen in their pajamas, hair tousled from sleep. "Good morning, princesses," Paul greeted, his voice gentle and affectionate. The girls hesitated a moment before drawing closer. Claire, always the bolder one, gave Paul a quick hug. Sophie, more reserved, offered a small smile. "Grandpa, can we go to the park today?" Claire asked excitedly. Before Robert could answer, Paul gently intervened. "Actually, girls, I was thinking, maybe we could all go together, if that's all right with you." Sophie and Claire exchanged glances, silently communicating. Finally, Sophie spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Okay, but Grandpa has to come too, right?" The question, though innocent, highlighted the delicate nature of the situation. Paul quickly nodded, flashing a conciliatory look at his father. "Of course, it'll be a family day." Later at the park, Thomas found a moment to speak with Robert, who watched Paul playing with the girls in the distance. "How are you handling all this, Robert?" Thomas asked quietly. Robert sighed deeply. "It's complicated, Mr. Bennett. I'm happy Paul is back, truly, but you're afraid of losing your connection with the girls," Thomas finished gently. Robert nodded, emotion shining in his eyes. "They're my whole world, you know. After losing Amanda, taking care of them was what kept me going. And now you have to share," Thomas offered. "Robert, the girls' love for you won't diminish just because Paul is back. You're a fundamental part of their lives." Thomas watched Paul push Sophie on a swing while Claire climbed a nearby slide. "Look at him, Robert. He's trying, and the girls are starting to open up. That doesn't take away your role in their lives. In fact, I think it only makes it more important." Robert wiped his eyes, a slight smile forming on his lips. "You're right, Mr. Bennett. It's just sometimes it's hard to remember that." As the afternoon wore on, Thomas noticed small moments of progress. Claire asking Paul to tie her shoe, Sophie shyly sharing a flower she had picked. Small steps, but significant. Back at the mansion as the girls got ready for dinner, Thomas found Paul on the veranda, gazing thoughtfully at the garden. "How was the day for you?" Thomas asked, joining him. Paul took a deep breath before answering. "It was intense, wonderful and scary at the same time. There's so much I don't know about them, Thomas. So many moments I missed." Thomas placed a reassuring hand on Paul's shoulder. "The important thing is that you're here now, Paul. We can't change the past, but the future is in your hands." During dinner, Thomas observed the Peterson family with a mixture of joy and reflection. The girls, though still cautious, were more relaxed around Paul. Robert, for his part, seemed to have found a balance, sharing stories and laughter with his son. Later, in his office, Thomas reflected on the transformations of the past weeks. Robert's exoneration, Paul's return, the twins blossoming. It had all touched his life in ways he never could have predicted. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Sophie holding a drawing. "Mr. Thomas," she said timidly, "I made this for you." Thomas took the drawing, feeling a lump form in his throat. It was a colorful depiction of everyone in the house: Robert, Paul, Claire, Sophie, and in the center, Thomas. "It's our family," Sophie explained, a small smile on her face. "You're part of it now too." Moved, Thomas knelt down to hug the girl. "Thank you, Sophie. That means a lot to me." After Sophie left, Thomas looked at the drawing again, thinking about how much his life had changed. The wealth and business success that once seemed so vital now paled in comparison to the wealth of human connection he had discovered. Thomas knew the road ahead would still be challenging. Paul had to prove himself in his new job. The twins would continue their healing and adjustment, and Robert would have to find his place in this new family dynamic. But as he gazed at Sophie's drawing, Thomas felt a profound sense of purpose and belonging. He would do everything in his power to support this family, to be the friend and mentor they needed. As he prepared for sleep, Thomas reflected on the journey that had led him to this moment. The snowstorm that had nearly cost him his life had in fact given him a new reason to live. The connections he had formed, the bonds he had helped rebuild, these had filled a void in his soul he hadn't even known existed. Thomas fell asleep with a smile on his face, grateful for the unexpected path his life had taken, and looking forward to whatever the future held for this unlikely but precious family. The mansion, once a symbol of his status and isolation, was now a home brimming with life, love, and possibilities for healing and growth for everyone involved. The garden of the Bennett mansion shone under the summer sun, flowers of every color dancing gently in the breeze. Tables draped with white cloths and floral arrangements were scattered across the lawn, while the sound of laughter and cheerful conversation filled the air. Thomas Bennett surveyed the scene with a smile on his lips, hardly believing that a year had passed since that fateful snowy night. Today's celebration wasn't just a birthday party for Sophie and Claire, but a celebration of new beginnings for everyone involved. "A penny for your thoughts," a familiar voice snapped him out of his reverie. Robert approached, his eyes shining with happiness. Thomas chuckled softly. "Just thinking about how things have changed, my friend. Who would have thought we'd be here today after everything?" Robert nodded, his gaze drifting across the garden. "Indeed, sometimes I still catch myself waiting to wake up and find it was all a dream." Not far away, Paul was helping the twins set up a small makeshift stage. The girls laughed as they tried to hang a colorful banner, their faces lit with a joy unimaginable a year ago. "Paul seems to be doing well," Thomas remarked. Robert smiled, pride evident in his voice. "He is. His job at the tech company has been good for him, and seeing how devoted he is to the girls, well, it warms this old heart of mine." Thomas watched as Paul interacted with his daughters, patient and loving. Their process of reconnection hadn't been easy, but with time, therapy, and plenty of love, they were building a solid relationship. "And you, Robert, how do you feel about all this?" The former gardener sighed contentedly. "Honestly, I've never been better. The new home is wonderful, and having my own garden to tend again, it's a dream come true. And the girls, well, they're still the light of my life. Only now I don't bear all the weight alone." Thomas nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude at how everything had turned out. His own life had undergone profound changes over the past year. Bennett Enterprises, once focused solely on profits, was now a leader in social responsibility initiatives. "Mr. Thomas, Mr. Thomas!" Sophie and Claire's excited voices called out to him. The twins ran in his direction, their festive dresses fluttering in the wind. "Hello, birthday girls," Thomas smiled, kneeling to their level. "Having fun?" Claire nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, and look what we made for you." She held out a folded piece of paper. Thomas opened it carefully, feeling a knot form in his throat. It was a handmade card decorated with glitter and colorful drawings. Inside, written in carefully traced childish letters, was, "Thank you for saving our family. With love, Sophie and Claire." You made this for me?" Thomas asked, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie, usually the quieter one, stepped forward. "Yes, Daddy told us how you helped him find a job and how you let all of us stay here in the beginning, and Grandpa said you helped clear his name." "You're our family now too," Claire added, with the simple honesty only a child can have. Thomas pulled them both into a hug, tears glistening in his eyes. "Thank you, girls. That means more to me than you can imagine." As the twins ran off to rejoin the guests, Paul approached Thomas. "They're right, you know," Paul said softly, "about you being family. I don't know how we'd have gotten through all this without you, Thomas." Thomas placed a hand on Paul's shoulder. "You're incredible people, Paul. All I did was give destiny a little push. The rest was all you." As the afternoon wore on, the celebration reached its peak. The twins blew out the candles on their birthday cake, making a wish amid applause and cheers. Friends, relatives, and even some former mansion staff had gathered to celebrate not just the girl's birthday, but the rebirth of a family. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold, Thomas slipped away from the party to find a quiet moment near a bed of roses. He couldn't help thinking about the night when it all began. The relentless snowstorm, the unexpected encounter with the twins, the shocking discovery of Robert in the abandoned plane. "A penny for your thoughts," a gentle voice surprised him. It was Margaret, his loyal housekeeper, approaching with 2 glasses of champagne. Thomas took the glass with a grateful smile. "Just reflecting on how life can change in an instant, Margaret. A year ago, I was a very different man." Margaret nodded, her wise eyes taking in the festive scene. "You certainly were, Mr. Bennet, but if I may say so, I much prefer this new Thomas." Thomas laughed softly. "So do I, Margaret, so do I." As they watched the party, Thomas felt a profound sense of gratitude. The mansion, once a symbol of his isolation and status, was now brimming with life and love. His business, once his only concern, was now just part of a life far richer and more meaningful. Robert tended a new garden, his skilled hands once again creating beauty from the earth. Paul had found his way back not just to his daughters, but to himself, rebuilding his life with determination and love. And the twins, Sophie and Claire, grew happier each day, their bright smiles a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. When night finally fell, gentle lights illuminated the garden, creating an almost magical atmosphere. The twins, tired but happy, fell asleep in Paul and Robert's arms. Thomas watched with a full heart, amazed at the power of forgiveness, redemption, and love. As the last guests said their goodbyes, Thomas walked over to a newly planted rosebed. It was a special project he and Robert had worked on together, a symbol of renewal and hope. Gently touching a rose petal, Thomas smiled to himself. Life, he realized, was like this garden. With care, patience, and love, even the harshest winters could give way to glorious springs. The sound of soft laughter caught his attention. Paul, Robert, Sophie, and Claire were approaching, their faces illuminated by the moonlight's gentle glow. "Hey, Thomas," Paul called with a smile. "How about one last family photo to end the night?" Thomas felt his heart swell with emotion. Family, a word that a year ago meant little to him beyond distant obligations. Now it was the center of his world. As they gathered for the photo, Thomas between Robert and Paul with the twins in front, he knew without a doubt this was only the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter full of challenges, surely, but also filled with love, growth, and infinite possibilities. And so, under the starlit sky, surrounded by flowers and the warmth of his new family, Thomas Bennet finally understood the true meaning of home.